My name is Colin, and I didn't plan for any of this, but the moment I stepped out of that building, I knew I wasn't walking away empty-handed. I started at the company back when we had 5 people sharing one conference room. We were still pitching to mid-market clients, still trying to make rent some months. The CEO at the time was hands-on, firm but fair. He valued loyalty. He noticed hard work. And when he handed me my first account, he said, "Make it yours. Build it like you own it." So I did. I treated every account like it was mine to lose. I built relationships, not just contracts. I traveled when I didn't have to. I picked up calls on weekends. And I brought in revenue they hadn't seen before. 17 years later, that portfolio was responsible for nearly 40% of total annual revenue. But that didn't matter anymore. The company had changed hands. New leadership. New mindset. All buzzwords and branding and streamlining. I could feel the shift months before it happened. They weren't asking me for strategy anymore, just reports. The new execs sat in glass offices and nodded while I walked them through numbers they didn't understand. I stopped hearing things like, "What do you recommend?" and started hearing things like, "Let's make it leaner." I knew what was coming, just not when. The official reason: realignment of roles due to evolving operational priorities. That's corporate for, we don't think you fit the image we're building. It would have hurt more if it weren't so predictable. I packed my things quietly, left my badge on the desk, no dramatic goodbye. I'd spent almost 2 decades in that office. I didn't want to give them a single minute more. By the time I got to my car, 3 things happened that told me this story wasn't over. First, my phone buzzed, a message from one of my clients. "Just heard something. Please tell me it's not true." Second, another message. "Who's our new point of contact now?" We were in the middle of finalizing quarter 3 and 3rd. A missed call from someone I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. That night, I sat down with a blank notebook and started writing. Not a plan, just names, relationships, conversations, history. Because I knew something they didn't. They thought firing me was cutting off a cost. What they really did was sever their link to people who didn't trust the company. They trusted me. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't post a cryptic message on LinkedIn. I didn't send a goodbye email. I just waited. Within 24 hours, 5 of my biggest clients had called me personally. Not one of them mentioned the company. They all asked the same thing. "What's next for you?" The truth, I didn't know. I'd always been loyal to one flag, but I realized the flag had changed, and maybe I'd been loyal to something that didn't exist anymore. I was 49. That number hit me harder than I expected. Not because I felt old, but because it made me realize how much of my identity I had poured into something I never actually owned. The severance package was decent. Not generous, just enough to keep things steady for a few months. But I didn't want to be bitter. I wasn't angry. I wasn't going to write a tell-all. I wasn't going to call out names, but I was going to remember. Because people don't call you at 9:30 p.m. unless something's really bothering them. And they don't call back the next day unless they're serious. By the end of the week, 9 of my long-standing clients had either reached out or scheduled calls. Not one had heard from the company since I left. The handoffs hadn't happened. The new reps didn't know the history. And some of the clients were already reconsidering their contracts. And I hadn't lifted a finger. I remember one call clearly. A VP at a major client said, "Colin, let me be honest. You leaving raised more red flags for us than any bad quarter ever could. You were the reason we stuck around. If you're going somewhere, tell me where." That was the moment I realized I wasn't unemployed. I was in transition. I didn't know what I wanted to build, but I knew what I didn't want. another title with no ownership, another corner office with no control, another system where good work was just data in a slide deck. The clients weren't just looking for a new rep, they were looking for something more stable, more personal, and most of them were quietly tired of being handled by executives who only showed up when there was a problem. I took meetings, I listened, I asked questions, and I wrote everything down. I wasn't rushing into anything. That's how people make the same mistakes twice, but I also wasn't going to sit still. At some point, I stopped thinking about revenge. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about building something that couldn't be taken away in a 15-minute meeting. I started talking to people I trusted. Not investors, not recruiters. People who'd built something from scratch and lived through the hard years. I asked about overhead, about service models, about liabilities, about compliance. I didn't want flashy, I wanted sustainable. One of the calls that stuck with me came from a senior partner at an old client firm. He said, "Colin, your departure sent a message. We've worked with your former company for a decade, but we've always worked with you. So we're reevaluating." I let that hang in the air. Then he added, "If you decide to start something of your own, we'll be your first call." And that's when I knew they hadn't fired me. They'd cut themselves off. You don't spend 17 years building relationships without building equity. And not the kind that shows up in a stock option. The kind that shows up in someone's phone log, in their trust, in the way they introduce you to their board and say, "This is Colin, we trust him." That kind of equity doesn't vanish with a layoff, but I also knew I had to be smart. I had to move carefully. There were contracts involved, non-solicits, expectations. I reviewed my old employment agreement line by line. I knew I couldn't initiate. But if they came to me, that wasn't a violation. And they were coming. I kept my responses neutral, professional. I never badmouthed the company. I just listened. I asked about their needs. I asked what wasn't working. And slowly, the gaps started to show. The company hadn't planned my departure. They hadn't prepped their new account managers. They hadn't communicated with the clients. They had assumed the name on the invoice mattered more than the person on the call. That was their mistake. By the third week, I had enough notes to see a pattern. Clients were frustrated. Timelines were slipping. Communication was patchy. And most of all, they felt like they were being handled, not helped. I didn't make any offers. I didn't draw up proposals. I just said one thing. If I can ever be useful to you, you know where to reach me. That was it. I wasn't chasing anything. I was creating space. And sometimes that's all people need to make a decision. I wasn't expecting what happened next. One of the largest accounts I had managed, the one that made up a significant portion of the company's annual revenue, emailed me and said, "We're giving them 30 days. After that, we're open to alternatives. Let us know if you're interested." That was the moment the equation changed. I wasn't just a former employee, I was a potential competitor. The moment that client said they were giving the company 30 days, I knew the window had opened. Not for revenge, not for retaliation, but for possibility. I remember just staring at the screen, reading that email twice, 3 times. I hadn't even asked for it. That was the part that stuck with me. I hadn't asked for anything. And still, the offer was there, plain as daylight. Let us know if you're interested. The truth was, I was interested. I just wasn't ready. Yet. I closed the laptop, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat by the window like I'd done 100 times before. But everything felt different now. It wasn't just about me anymore. If I took that step, it wasn't just me walking away. I'd be pulling business away from a company I'd helped build from the inside, a company I gave 17 years to. And yet, something in me had already turned, quietly, gradually. The loyalty I used to feel, it had faded. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. They had made a decision. I was allowed to make mine. That weekend, I met with an old colleague, someone I trusted, someone who'd started their own firm 2 years earlier. We sat down over coffee, and I told him everything. Not just the offer, but the pattern I was seeing. Clients reaching out, gaps forming, silence on the company's end. I asked him what he'd do in my position. He didn't hesitate, he said, "Start lean. Stay quiet. Build only what you can carry." I asked him what that looked like, practically. He said, "One client, one contract, one win, that's how it starts." So I started there. I didn't call it a business, not yet. I called it a service, just me, Colin, with a phone, a laptop, and 17 years of knowing exactly what not to do. The first proposal I wrote took me 4 days, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted it to say exactly what needed to be said, nothing more. It was direct, specific, and focused. I wasn't trying to match the old company's structure. I was offering something better: personal ownership, direct accountability, no middlemen, and no marketing fluff. I sent it out on a Monday morning. By Tuesday, I had a signed agreement, and just like that, I was back in business. Only this time, I was doing it on my terms. The first project wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even particularly profitable, but it was solid, it was familiar, and it gave me structure. I set my hours, I defined my scope, I controlled the deliverables, and more than anything, I had skin in the game. There's a kind of energy that comes from knowing every hour counts, that no one's handing you a paycheck unless you earn it. But I didn't feel pressure. I felt clear, like all the noise had been stripped away and all that was left was work worth doing. 3 weeks in, another client called. They'd received a transition email from the company introducing their new account rep. No phone call, no check-in, just a standard template with a name and a calendar link. The client said, "We're not impressed." I said, "I understand." Then they asked, "Would you be willing to consult with us directly?" I told them I'd need to check my schedule. I gave it 24 hours. Then I said yes. That made 2. I still hadn't announced anything publicly. I hadn't filed the LLC. I hadn't built a website. I was focused entirely on delivery, making sure the people who trusted me were getting more than they expected. I answered every email personally. I set honest timelines. I admitted when I didn't know something, and followed up once I did. And slowly, word started to spread. By month 2, I had 3 active contracts and a 4th pending. I finally registered the business, something simple, under my own name, nothing flashy. I wasn't interested in looking like a startup. I wanted to look like someone who knew exactly what he was doing, because I did. One night, I got a message from someone who used to work under me, a quiet, detail-oriented guy who never made a fuss, but always delivered. He'd heard what happened. He said, "If you ever need help with back-end reporting or analysis, I'd love to pitch in." I hired him the next day. Part-time, project-based, fair pay, simple terms. He didn't ask for a title. He just wanted to work on something that made sense, and that's how it grew. I wasn't advertising. I wasn't pitching. I was just solving problems I already understood, for people I already trusted, and who trusted me. Meanwhile, the company I'd left was stumbling. Clients were still reaching out to me, not for pitches but for help. Some just wanted advice. Others wanted options. A few were simply venting, frustrated with how quickly things had shifted once I was gone. I never said, "Leave them." I just said, If you're not getting what you need, you deserve better. It wasn't a sales tactic, it was the truth. Then one day, I received a certified letter from their legal team. It wasn't aggressive, just a reminder about my non-solicit agreement. Standard language, standard pressure. But it made one thing clear: they were watching. I took it seriously. I had my lawyer review every clause, every line, and he came back with the same answer I already knew. You're in the clear. You haven't solicited anyone. They came to you. Still, I kept everything documented. Every client email, every timestamp, every offer made. I wasn't about to let someone rewrite my story in a courtroom. And while they were busy sending warnings, I was busy delivering results. That's the difference. At the 3-month mark, I had 6 active clients. Each of them had worked with me for years before. Each of them had left the company after I was let go. Not because I asked them to, because the trust wasn't transferable. And that's what the new leadership never understood. You can't build trust with automation. You can't replace relationships with dashboards. You can't assume a client will stay loyal to a name on the building when the person they called in a crisis has been shown the door. One afternoon, I received a call I didn't expect. It was from someone still at the company, someone I respected, someone who'd always played things straight. They said, "We're hearing from several clients that you're now working with them directly." I said, "That's true." They asked, "Are you open to talking?" I paused. Then I said, "I'm always open to listening." A week later, we sat down. Neutral ground. No pressure. They asked if I'd consider coming back, in a consultant role. Not as an employee, as an outside partner to handle high-priority legacy accounts. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either. I asked them one question. What changed? They looked uncomfortable. Then they said, "The transition hasn't gone the way we expected." That was all I needed to hear. They weren't offering respect, they were offering containment. They didn't want my insight, they wanted control. So I politely declined. And as I walked out of that meeting, I realized something else. They hadn't built anything. They'd inherited a system that worked. And when they cut me out of it, they assumed it would still run. But people aren't interchangeable, and trust doesn't survive on autopilot. By month 4, I hired my second contractor, someone who specialized in client onboarding and service delivery. She brought structure to the chaos. She helped me streamline what was becoming too much for one person to carry. I finally built a website. Nothing fancy, just a landing page, contact info, and a mission statement written in plain language. We help businesses solve real problems through real relationships, no scripts, no layers, just solutions. And people responded. Not just old clients, new ones too, referrals, introductions. Heard your name from so-and-so. Was told to give you a call. I never expected any of it, but I knew how to handle it. Because when you spend 17 years doing the work, not just talking about it, not just presenting it, but doing it deeply and consistently, people remember. They don't remember the software you used, or the slide decks you built. They remember how you showed up, how you followed through, how you made them feel when things got complicated. That's what stays, and that's what walked out the door with me the day I was fired. Now, I was building something new, not to spite them, but to honor everything I'd learned. And slowly, it was working. It's strange. When you leave a place after nearly 2 decades, you expect the world to go quiet. You brace for silence, for that lonely kind of starting over. But for me, it was the opposite. The longer I stayed away, the louder it got. The more the phones rang. The more the inbox filled up. And not just with work opportunities, with messages. Some were from clients, others from colleagues. A few from people I barely remembered, but who had apparently watched how I handled things over the years and decided I was worth reaching out to now. There was something about the way I left, cleanly, without noise, that seemed to echo louder than any announcement I could have made. But I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was trying to protect my time. There's something sacred about starting over in your 40s. You don't romanticize it. You don't chase excitement. You look at what matters and you cut the rest. By month 5, I had a waiting list. Not because I wanted to build hype, but because I didn't want to hire recklessly. I'd seen what rushed growth looked like. It always came at a cost. So I slowed things down. I looked at each client like a long-term partnership, not a transaction. I set expectations early, I communicated boundaries, and I stayed small on purpose. There's a temptation when you get traction, to scale fast, to chase volume. But I kept coming back to something that had stuck with me during those 17 years. The most profitable relationships were never the biggest. They were the clearest. Clarity, I've learned, beats size every time. It was around that time I heard from someone else I hadn't expected, a senior client contact from one of the company's oldest accounts, a relationship I'd managed for over a decade. She didn't mince words. She said, "I can't keep working with people who don't understand the history, who treat every request like a ticket." I said, "What are you looking for?" She said, "I'm looking for someone who knows what happens when things go wrong, and doesn't disappear when they do." That call turned into a conversation. That conversation turned into a proposal. That proposal became the largest contract I'd signed to date. Not because of size, but because of trust. When the paperwork came through, I sat in my small office, a converted guest room in the back of my house, and just stared at the numbers. Not out of shock, out of calm. It was working. Quietly, steadily. I wasn't just rebuilding a career. I was proving a principle. When you do the work right, people remember. And when the alternative is noise, delay, and indifference, they come looking for what they used to have. I never marketed myself as a savior. I never framed the company as the villain. I didn't need to. The contrast was doing all the talking. One of the more surreal moments came in month 7. I got a message from someone who used to be a senior exec at the company, the same person who had once signed off on my raise back in the early days. They'd left a year before I was let go and had since joined a private investment group. They were putting together a portfolio of specialized service providers, and they wanted to know if I'd be interested in partnering on a few selective engagements. It wasn't an offer I expected, but it wasn't one I ignored either. We met, we talked, and within weeks we had a structured agreement. I'd support 3 of their mid-size ventures, short-term, with the option to extend. Suddenly, I had to make decisions I hadn't planned on making yet. Do I grow? Do I staff? Do I risk complexity? It's easy to say yes to everything when momentum's on your side, but I didn't want to replicate the very system I had walked away from. So, I brought on one more person, part-time, operations-minded, someone who could keep the back end clean while I focused on what I knew best: relationships, problem-solving, and delivery. At the 8-month mark, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I'd gone from being blindsided by a firing to running a sustainable, fully independent business, one that wasn't just surviving but steadily growing. And not $1 came from cold calls. Not one pitch deck, not one paid ad, just connection, reputation, and consistency. I remember walking through a grocery store on a random Tuesday, middle of the day, no meetings, no pressure. I stopped in the middle of the aisle and just stood there. Because for the first time in years, I realized something. I was no longer trying to protect a role. I was protecting my time. I wasn't proving my worth to anyone else. I was proving it to myself. And that did something to me. It realigned my ambition. I didn't want to build an empire. I wanted to build something durable, something thoughtful, something honest, something that could outlast noise. By the end of that year, nearly 60% of my client base had followed me from the previous company. Not because I chased them, but because they wanted something that couldn't be found in process flows and task trackers. They wanted someone who picked up the phone when it mattered. The company I left, they shifted again. New org chart. Another restructure. I'd hear whispers through former contacts. More turnover, more confusion, more clients on pause. They still hadn't replaced what I used to do. But here's the thing, they couldn't. Not because I was irreplaceable, but because what I built over those 17 years had never been documented. It had never lived in a manual. It lived in trust, in context, in the quiet details I'd stored up every time I listened just a little longer than required. And when they let me go, they didn't just lose a person. They lost the blueprint. The final moment that told me I'd done the right thing came nearly a year to the day after I was let go. A new client came on board, referred by someone I hadn't worked with in 5 years. He said, "I've heard you're the guy people go to when they don't want to waste time explaining the basics." That line stuck with me, because it wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, it was practical. And that's what I'd built. A reputation not for being the loudest, but for being the clearest. I sat down one night, a late Sunday, and wrote something out by hand. Just for me, no audience, no post, just a reminder. Don't build what you can't maintain. Don't chase what you don't believe in. Don't stay where you're only tolerated. Build quietly, build well, and never forget how this started. That page still sits beside my desk, because every time I look at it, I remember what it felt like to be told I was no longer needed, and what it meant to realize that wasn't the end of anything.